Soms in de briefing, ja.
You are going to talk, of course.
Ik heb het gelezen.
Ja. Ik ga dingen voorlezen, dat is heel slecht. Maar ik schrijf altijd wat ik zou zeggen.
6 o'clock.
Echt?
Ja, ik weet dat het heel slecht is, maar ik voel me gewoon echt lekkerder als ik het gewoon voorlees.
Ja?
Ja.
Why not taking
Dat is wel, maar dat ligt... Ja, dan moet je gewoon een paar keer niet doen en dan ben je er vanaf. Het is een beetje zoals roken.
Zal ik het dan nu proberen? Dan
Ja.
heel hard op mijn bek gaan?
Ja.
Ja.
Ja. Daar ben ik graag bij.
It's 2 minutes, I think. Yeah.
All right. Is speaking to microphone because we are recording everything. So
Ga ik toch maar wel voorlezen.
Okay.
Ja, dat het wordt, ja.
10 minutes to.
Oké.
I will come, telling you that you have 10 minutes left.
This is our chair.
I'm your chair,
Our
yeah.
chair.
I'll end on time.
Hallo. Hi, Rob. Weinberg. Hallo.
Maggie.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Hallo.
Perfect. Okay, yeah, that's good.
Oh,
Is it time to start?
good thing.
All right, thank you everybody so much for being here. I know that there were a couple of competitors, the CEO of the New York Times, the Sun, so, you know, the bar. Assisi is close as well. So thank you so much for being here with us at 6 on Saturday of a very intense and full festival. I am Nienke Venema. I am the director of the Democracy and Media Foundation, Stichting Democratie en Media. This is a Dutch foundation based in Amsterdam. And a little bit about us, we were founded during the Second World War to be the sole owner of one of the resistance newspapers after the war would end, because the people that founded this newspaper didn't believe in commercial ownership of media, so they wanted it to be owned by a foundation instead. Now, 70 years later, a lot has happened, but we're still a shareholder of a couple of dailies in the Netherlands, and we also fund journalism and we fund media organizations. I wrote to the Journalism Festival about the possibility of hosting this panel because since I have been working at the Democracy and Media Foundation, before that I was applying for grants, not as a journalist, I've noticed that there isn't a whole lot of exchange between media and philanthropy on mutual needs and expectations. How many of you are journalists in the room? Okay, good. How many of you are funders of journalism in the room? All right. Right, well, I'm happy to see some hands go up. That's good. Because it should be an exchange rather than just me talking at you or us talking at you. Nor is there really an ongoing conversation amongst funders themselves about the ins and outs and do's and don'ts of funding media. Nevertheless, this relationship is becoming increasingly relevant. The financial difficulties facing media, I don't need to elaborate on those, and it shows no signs of slowing down. So, therefore, this panel here today, I have the honor of introducing the various panelists to you. Rob Weinberg, next to me, is the founder and editor-in-chief of The Correspondent and more recently The Correspondent. I hope you've all heard that they're expanding to the United States together with Jay Rosen. It's a relatively young online journalism platform, media platform, well known for having crowdfunded its origins and being one of relatively few startups running on a successful business model based on subscriptions and no advertising. However, it also started off, aside from that very successful beginning, there was also a grant from us, so I'll be transparent about that, which in part also allowed it to develop. So, and you also do sometimes apply for funds to do extra projects. Next to Rob is Maria Teresa Ronderos, the director of the OSF program on independent journalism, and one of two people from Latin America at this festival this week. Formerly an award-winning journalist in Colombia, Maria Teresa now invests in journalism as well as in the protection of the safety of journalists, supports initiatives led by individuals or collectives that strive to improve their journalism under difficult circumstances, and prioritizes and not just that, also seek to further engage their audiences, experiment with storytelling, and develop new sources of revenue, a media funding program. OSF is well known for many other things, but this is also a large part of their mission statement. Next to Maria Teresa, Maggie O'Kane. Maggie O'Kane, currently multimedia editor investigations at The Guardian, but will leave The Guardian after 25 years next week to be full-time on the global media campaign to end female genital mutilation. She's a former foreign correspondent, the founder of The Guardian Films, and also the future chair of the European Press Prize. The Guardian, of course, we all know how they work, but they also do sometimes take grants from various foundations. And then the last person on this panel is not in philanthropy, and he will tell you that. I think, perhaps, at least that's what he told me. But he is the director of the digital news initiative that was started by Google and a couple of other partners. He funds projects. He's a former editor-in-chief of Liberation.France and also a Nieman Fellow, and also many other things. And I know I'm talking too long. But the DNI is a partnership between Google and news publisher in Europe to support high-quality journalism through technology and innovation, gives out grants, but also invests in training and research, amongst other things. Since it was founded in 2015, it has awarded more than 50 million euros to more than 250 projects. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that's been going for you. But first of all, if you could all perhaps just very briefly elaborate on what your relationship is to this subject and what the first thing is that comes to mind when you talk about media and philanthropy. Rob, will you start?
Oh, do I have to start? Okay.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm first in line. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Nieke. What comes to mind in this subject? First of all, what comes to mind is this stressed relationship between foundations and journalists in general. There's, I experience a lot of distrust over and between those parties, especially amongst journalists, of course, because journalists feel any kind of funding coming from foundations or other parties, maybe like Google, could hurt their independence. And there are many reasons to think so. My experience has been that there can also be very good relationships between foundations and journalists. We have had many of those relationships. One is sitting next to me. Others are for smaller projects that are funded by outside money. And basically we have a couple of rules in place for accepting grant money or applying for grant money. The first one is very simple. There has to be no editorial control whatsoever, or no editorial demands whatsoever. If that's not granted, then we won't accept any money at all. Second, and that's the hardest part, is there has not only to be like official independence between the grantee and the grantor, but also the appearance of independence. So we always ask ourselves the question: would we want to advertise this relationship between the foundation and us, or the other way around? Would we like them to advertise their support of us? And if the answer is no, we would not like to have that, because there would be a seemingly conflict of interest, or we would be associated with like political agendas a foundation might have. Then we would not accept such grants. That's one of the reasons probably why we usually only work with foundations that are that support journalism as such. So you have many foundations that support all kinds of political causes, whether it's renewable energy or conflicts in third world countries, and they might support media as well. We usually do not work together with those kinds of foundations. We work together most closely with foundations that support journalism in general. And it has been very fruitful. There have been many misunderstandings as well. So one misunderstanding, we keep getting is the views on the role of technology in journalism. So technology has always been and still is seen as a very expensive like side thing for journalists. It's usually the journalism itself that is considered most important, but not the technology that is behind it. So that's always a constant struggle to try to explain why technology in a digital era is important as well and needs funding as well. But for the most part, we found that working together with foundations that support independent journalism has been very fruitful to us. The only thing, and that might be my call out to funders, and there, I saw 4 of them sitting right here, is that usually the logic in with funders is that if something that is funded is successful and can manage on its own, then that's a reason to stop funding it, because it's independent now, it can make its own money or stuff like that, which is an understandable reasoning, but is also, it has its disadvantages, because right at the moment that something is becoming successful and can stand on its own, it might be there might be even more reasons to fund it more and accelerate growth, for example, and think more business-like about funding such projects, instead of thinking, okay, this worked, let's move on to something that needs our help next. So thinking like business-wise in granting money to, for example, startups like ours would be a smart thing, I think.
Thank you. Maria Teresa?
Okay, thank you, Ninki, for inviting me here. So what we do in, so this program that I direct of the Open Society Foundations is based in London, and we fund basically three big things. One is protection of journalists and safety, and how to keep journalists, especially those who are doing the most dangerous work, protected. And we don't do it directly, of course, because we're just funders, so we just try to support organizations that do that very well, whether some of them are global, but we are trying more and more to find really key local or regional players that need to become stronger. So that's one thing. The other thing is we try to fund ideas, and this is very, very difficult. Ideas of people in places where things are very difficult, when there's little competition in terms of, because it's so difficult to produce really independent information. There's lots of information, but not very independent. And so people really want to develop something that's really, truly independent in a place where information is very scarce. And we do fund very carefully some startups, and in some cases some more mature organizations that want to do a specific development because they need support, as you were saying, in their technology, or because they need to really put together their advertising department, or just simply because they want to cover a region that's completely costly to cover for a while, and there is a reason that they want to develop that part. And we also fund experimentation. So sometimes to experiment for a small startup company or for a small digital company can be very costly, and it could go down the tube, down the drain if it fails in the experimentation. So we try and say, okay, you experiment with donors funding, because if you lose it, it's not going to be the end of the organization. Again, it's a very difficult thing to decide. Now, the third bucket that we support is investigative journalism, mostly networking, the collaboration between different investigative journalists, trying to work together, trying to add value and pool resources. Why? Because we think that all the big evils of the world are now working globally. So crime, money laundering, tax evasions. All of these things are working beyond a country. So to really do good investigative journalism, you need to be working and also beyond the country. So this is my daily bread. This is what I've been doing for the last, 2.5 years. Before that, I was a journalist with an independent project that was looking for funders to get me funding. So I know very well how it feels to, I hope I don't forget, and probably this is something really important not to forget. So what have we tried to do? And what, I don't want to talk about that. I want to talk about what are the issues that I deal with every day, very, very shortly. About the power dynamics. Of course you're a funder. Of course you want, and you go to an NGO and you ask them, what would you like to do? And what would you like me to fund? And immediately they're going to try and fit your agenda. And it's very difficult to have an honest conversation because, of course, they're trying to say, what do you do first? And then I'll tell you what I'll do. And if you tell them I fund safety, then they'll say, I'll do safety. And that's a big mistake of a lot of, and I see it as a mistake. The other thing is the transparency. Okay, so I'm really all for transparency. I think it has a lot to do with the credibility of a media, that they say out loud who funds them. But in some countries, this costs you your life. So if you say you are being funded, especially by the Open Society Foundations, not the most popular funder in the world right now, for many governments, so it's going to be hard for this. So yes, we want to be transparent, we are transparent, but only as far as the grantees want us to be transparent. If they don't want us to be transparent because it depends their survival on it, we will not be. And there are the issues of impact, influence, results. A lot of funders go and say, I need to see results. So that's another big issue we handle, we sort of grapple with every day. If you have problems convincing funders that technology is important, we have problems convincing grantees that technology is important. And that you cannot be a journalist today if you don't understand your audiences. You cannot think that you have a superb site, that you're producing the best journalism possible if you don't know who's reading it and why and how does it connect, and you're not using the amount of technology there is to be able to engage this journalist. Journalism is not anymore, it's a conversation, it's not a lecture anymore. And then the last thing is, how long? So you said you shouldn't drop somebody the next day, but it's true. But when I arrived to this place, that we were funding people for 17 years. So if you fund somebody from 17 years, probably you're not doing them a favor, or at least if you keep the funding at the same level, because you're not actually helping them become entrepreneurial, or as Ninka said in her little document, you don't leave them their wings to fly. So I think they have to be independent from us. And the best story that I will end with is, I went to one of the grantees' door one day in Nepal, and she had a little sign in her door that say, $1 a day keeps the donor away.
Maggie, yes.
Maggie, so I'm looking at everybody in this audience and thinking, I don't know how you are all still here. So I am going to talk very, very briefly from just personal experience and just tell you what I've learned about journalism and funding. And I just want to say that I used to be a foreign correspondent in the days when they said, go to Bosnia and here's a whole load of money and come back whenever you're done. And money really wasn't an issue in those days, certainly for us at The Guardian. And then I moved into the world of films and making films, which is a much more expensive proposition, and realised that you had to go out there and actually pitch for funding. And in the last 10 years, I've realised that actually now you have to go out there and pitch for funding for journalism that matters, because the things that slide off the end are the things like investigative journalism, are the issues like slavery, are the issues like women's issues. So we have to really fight to keep those on the media agenda, and we desperately, not desperate, I don't want to sound desperate, but there's a reality here that unless philanthropists and unless funders fund those issues, then they are not going to be covered in the modern day newspaper. And you're looking at one of the most successful media organisations in the world that's losing 40 million a year. That's The Guardian, and is looking around saying, well, where can we cut? What can we do? The first thing that gets cut are issues like FGM, are issues like women's rights. So unless we have the funders who can come in and support that, then there's a really serious problem for modern day journalism to keep doing things that matters. Now I'm just going to show you a very, very tiny clip. And I was kind of a bit ambivalent about whether or not I should show this, because it's sort of, isn't The Guardian great? Look at all the coverage. But this is a very short film about, it's called Supermarket Slave Trade, and it's about the impact that had, and it's about finding out the prawns that you eat on your table, where did they come from, and the fact that men are held as slaves for 3 or 4 years on a boat to feed those cheap prawns to your supermarkets. That's an issue that's very, very important to journalism. We would not have been able to tell that if Humanity United hadn't come along and said, we want to do slavery. And once they said that, we said, okay, we'll go and find the stories that will make the front page. And that's the important thing. The funder has to come, it can come with a big picture and say we want to do slavery, but then it has to say to the journalists, okay, you go off and you decide what are the stories that are going to really matter. So this very short clip is just about the impact that $30,000 had on the issue of modern day slavery and why philanthropists are so important.
Qatar is a slave state. That's an extreme thing to say, I know, in the 21st century, but that's the reality.
Well, with me is Bhagavat Yogi from the BBC's Nepalese service. And Bhagavat, what exactly are they alleging?
But this is the first time that a major British newspaper has reported on this issue and brought it to the international audience.
We were really excited about the partnership with The Guardian. Through this partnership, we really wanted to reach a global audience. We wanted to change people's perceptions about the face of modern slavery across the globe. From the plight of Nepalese workers to the plight of workers enslaved on Thai fishing vessels.
The shrimp on our tabletops could have gotten there thanks to slave labor. The Guardian finding men working on Thai fishing boats bought and sold for some
moderne vorm van slavernij, zo noemen sommigen het. Migranten uit Myanmar en Cambodja die 20 uur aan een stuk op vissersboten werken en maandenlang op zee moeten blijven.
C'est le quotidien britannique Le Guardian qui l'a révélé au terme d'une longue enquête sur les bateaux, on torture et on tue.
This is the story of globalized slavery. How giant international supermarkets like Walmart, Tesco, Carrefour, Morrison's and Iceland are selling prawns fed by slave labor.
Joining us now is Felicity Lawrence, who was one of the reporters on the Guardian investigation.
It took us nearly 6 months to prove all the links. We followed catches from boats where we knew there were people who were enslaved in the most appalling conditions.
And Mark Legan, former ambassador for the State Department's Office to Monitor and Combat Trafficking in Persons.
The Guardian has done a great service of taking studies that were done by the International Organization for Migration, the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, and others, and really gotten into the details of the evidence.
So there are 4 nations that were on this so-called Tier 2 watch list and have been moved down to Tier 3, really the most serious offenders.
The lowest category among 23 countries that the United States says are not meeting minimum standards to address modern slavery.
This is not just a book, it's not just a report, this is a call to action.
I think this is excellent journalism by The Guardian, because if you're going to stop this, or if you're going to stop the abuse of textile workers in Bangladesh, whatever it may be, at the end of the day, there are only 2 agents who can do this. It is the massive buying power of the big supermarkets in the Western world, and secondly, it's you and me.
Millions of people have come to the site and have consumed the content. we believe in many respects that it's investigative reporting like this and stories like this that could be the real catalyst for change for migrant workers and for modern slaves around the globe.
So that wouldn't have happened. There's no way that a foreign editor in The Guardian could have put 6 months into that story. So that's the reality of where we're at. So just in terms of practicalities, because I think we've got to be practical here, we were in Turin talking about, funding and journalism. What I really realised was that it was like a kind of unhappy courtship, an unhappy love affair. Nobody really knew quite what to say and how to do it. And I just think there needs to be sort of clearer rules in terms, not rules, but just, clarity that actually funders are looking for good ideas, they're looking for good stories. Journalists, you have to be more than just journalists now. You have to actually say, okay, I'm going to pitch this, I'm going to sell this, I'm going to sell it internally in my media organisation and say this is important. And if I'm a freelancer, I'm going to go to people like the European Fund for Journalism and say this is important. So you have to go from being the journalist who said, I don't get involved in all this commercial stuff, to being salespeople if you really want it to do those stories that matter. And the last thing I would say to the funders is, you have to become journalists almost. You find the people who care. If you want to do something, you look at the media organisations and say, who is the person who's been writing about this for 10 years? Because they will care. And then you sit down with them and say, okay, how do we do this? And when you've worked out your plan, then you go back to the media organisation and say, this is what I would like to do. So there's my 2 top tips. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. And Ludovic? We take the honor of being the last.
Okay, so find the people who care. I think that's really important because those stories should absolutely happen, and the news ecosystem, the media are today struggling a lot. The economics are complicated. Finding new way to diversify the revenue stream, those are really big issues. We are not funding through the D&I Innovation Fund content. What we are funding is projects. When I talk about project, what I'm talking about? I spent more than 15 years in newsroom. I was a journalist, I was editor-in-chief, but also CDO. So I would say I was on both the content side and the more product/business side. What is very difficult to figure out is how to come with solution, or at least with idea, to follow the new way people are consuming the news, to engage with the readers, to find new recipes in order to diversify the revenue. And we know that there are no single recipes anymore. So what was lacking, really, I felt that deeply, and the more I'm talking with people within the ecosystem, is time. Time to kind of step back from the daily operations, work with others, not just between journalists, but also with engineers, with design thinkers, with product person, with people to build the visions together. What we're offering through the fund is a kind of space to step back, build a vision, take risk, and test ideas. So we are funding specific projects. We are not exactly funding company, we are funding companies through a project. And what we are doing actually is not just funding, is stimulation. And this is not a single separated initiative. D&I is a broader initiative than just a fund. The Digital News Initiative is built upon 3 pillars. First one is product. How through technology with Google Engineer, we can try to come with product that would help to solve problems and tackle big challenges. For example, accelerated mobile pages that would help to display much more quickly the content on mobile. Second pillar is about research and training. It's training provided in newsroom by the News Lab, and the research component is a partnership with the Reuters Institute to make a report about what's going on in the news ecosystem in Europe. And the third pillar is called innovation. And the answer today is through a fund, because we know that money also help to stimulate, to think about project. But what we value more, and that's why I say it's about stimulation and innovation, it's not about modernization, and we revalue the application process itself. And that goes to the idea of take time and think with others, collaborate with others. So the application process in itself is really valuable. Funded or not, you have a project that you are proud of. You have the opportunity to challenge yourself, to think from a user perspective, to try to figure out what kind of answer you can provide to something that for you makes sense, but that has also to be seen in other shows, which are today the reader's shows.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm very pleased that these four wonderful people have made it to this panel, and as you've already heard a little bit in the introductions, there are many hats and roles that are sitting here. So there's actually former editor-in-chief of a newspaper, as well as editor-in-chief of not a startup, but a digital native platform on media platform. And then there's a former investigative journalist who's now heading an independent journalism program. There's Maggie, who has worked at The Guardian for 25 years, and also worked a lot with philanthropy, and is also working now in activism. And then there's Ludovic at the end, former editor-in-chief, former intern, and now head of this Google Digital News Initiative. So there are many questions, and I'm sure you can imagine that there are many questions that I would like to ask, and I have a lot of them written down. But what's actually much more interesting is, what are your questions? Because what I very strongly believe is that since journalism and media is an essential part of a healthy democratic society, and they're struggling financially as much as they are from the digital disruption, from all sorts of things, we should probably convince more foundations to invest in media and journalism. And for that, we need great examples of how it works, because what I've noticed is that funders like knowing exactly what they'll get. And therefore, it's sometimes hard to fund media, because you don't know what the impact will be. You don't know even sometimes what the impact is that's being aimed for. And for this, we need to have a conversation with each other. We need to better understand each other. So if there are any questions in this room right now, I'd love to take them. I'm sure you came here for a reason, and you're not outside in the sun, but you're here. So tell me, what would you like to know? Does somebody have a mic? Mike is coming. All right. I think there was somebody over there. Yes? And could you introduce yourself?
Okay, my name is Idris de Bruyne and I'm working for journalismfund.eu. Oh, stand up. My God. And the question is, what do you prefer to fund, media or journalism? And what is the most difficult one?
And is it for someone in particular, or is it for everyone?
Open Society Foundations?
Okay.
I think our focus is on journalism more than media, because journalism today not necessarily is a media outlet. Journalism can be a fund like Journalism Fund. It could be a network. It could be an initiative. It could be a project. It could be, it has many shapes and forms. It could be a program which has to do with learning by doing and training in a network, which is, we've seen a lot today, and it's working especially in investigative journalism very well. So that's, we prefer to fund journalism. Now, the aspect of the media, sometimes it's important because it helps, even if it's a tiny little media, even if it doesn't have an office, even if it's just a media in the virtual space, it needs to develop other tools apart from the pure capacity to produce journalism. And because, especially in many other countries, in many countries where things are so difficult, if you don't have some degree of independence and some degree of knowledge of the digital atmosphere where you're moving, you're not going to get very far. So we see amazing journalism we would love to fund, and we actually do fund. And then we see it's going to die because the journalists refuse to have anything to do with rolling their sleeves and getting together with the techie guys or getting together with the business guys and at least give it a think, give it a thought. So the best journalism in many countries, it's completely divorced from anything that could actually last in any shape or form, whether it's called media outlet or whatever it is.
Thank you. Anybody want to respond to that within the panel? I'm just trying to do a new thing where there's not just static. Yes, Rob? Okay, yeah. No, please, yeah.
No, I saw a question.
Oh, you saw a question.
Yeah.
All right, yes. And I'm sure there are, yes?
No, just one thing. The way we are looking at innovation should be broad and open. So I think it's very hard to say, are we funding media, journalism, journalists themselves? I would say we should try to stimulate everyone because the new ideas, the new recipes, the new experiences will come with this, I would say, new way of thinking and trying to challenge each other. What is important is also to be able to share the learning at some point and to make sure it can be inspiring for others.
The learning of the journalists or the learning of the funders?
The learning of the projects
we
are funding. Okay, because at the end of the day, I think you can be a media, you can be a journalist, you are facing similar kind of issues. So if we can learn from each other and be kind of open source in our project, and I don't say this way that the project that are going through the DNI fund should be open source, but it's a way to say open-minded and share what has worked, what has not, and try to learn from each other. I think it's very important.
And for somebody who has worked in funding projects for the last 2 years, what's your best lesson to share? What's a do and a don't? Doesn't have to be the best one. Maybe that's a lot of pressure, but what's a do and a don't?
About sharing, you mean?
No, about funding. And also, especially, maybe because we don't have funders that many funders in the room. I wish it was full of funders. We should have this conversation with funders.
Yeah.
But we're having it mostly with journalists. So I'm sure there's a lot of people here who apply for grants sometimes, and you see all these applications coming in. You once told me that you read pretty much all of them, right?
Yeah,
yourself.
absolutely.
So what's a do and a don't that you could give to the people in the room?
Okay, so first, in our case, it's not about content. So don't put just the content, but create projects that would help to finance, sustain journalism, but that cannot be just the content. Then focus on specific idea, go in depth. An idea is not enough. Provide KPIs, explain why it has opportunities, why it's innovative, and innovation is very complicated. How would you describe innovation? So we've decided not to define innovation and to look at it as a process. So explain the process. Explain what is your starting point, what is innovative for you, but also what does it have an impact on the news ecosystem or for others. So that's kind of tips I can share.
Thank you.
And just one suggestion I would have is I think it's important now for journalists to make alliances. So when you go to a funder, if you have an idea, many people are working now more as freelance. You know, you go to Channel 4, you go to The Guardian, you go and try and create a package that says this is a multimedia operation, there are alliances that can be brought in. Or the correspondent people got in touch with, you know, The Guardian people and said, let's pull this together, let's make sure that when we have something like WikiLeaks, that there's a massive, you know, attempt to broaden it beyond this idea of one media organisation. So think alliances, I would say, and think different media.
Thank you. Rob, what's your biggest headache? When I know you're probably not the person that does apply for the funds yourself. Maybe you have someone for that.
Yeah.
But can you sort of, from the correspondent's point of view, say what's your biggest headache when it comes to applying for funding? How can people in the room that are applying maybe deal with that, and what could funders do better?
Maybe the biggest headache is that if you truly try something new, then it's very hard to prove what you think you can get out of it. So we had a lot of ideas that that when you apply for a grant for something, then immediately you're asked for, like, what's the business case and what are the KPIs and stuff like that. And for a lot of proven things or things that you've seen elsewhere, you can provide those kinds of criteria. You can say, you can point to other examples, like this has been tried in that country and it worked, or it didn't work and we learned this and that. But if you experiment on a level that you want to try something that has never done before, or you haven't seen any examples elsewhere, and you still have to go through this process of trying to provide assurance that this is going to work because the funder needs some proof of concept, or they need to explain to their board or somebody else that this is worth funding because of the results they will expect. Then those really new stuff gets smothered because you can't prove something that doesn't exist yet. So our biggest headache for and it's not a daily thing or something, but sometimes we would wish that some funders would act more like, or think more like venture capitalists, in the sense that they will fund it no matter what. Like, let's try this. If it's successful, great. If it's not, then we know we learned something. But trying to extract all these kinds of expected results beforehand pushes you into some kind of conservatism to go with ideas, or to stick with ideas that already shown these kinds of results they expect. So sometimes having less information and expecting less information, and just trust more on the ability or the talent or the imagination of the people asking for the grant would definitely help. But we see this especially in foundations that are government driven. So, for example, we have done this with a few European Union grants, and the questionnaires that you had to fill in was already like a day job for 2 people, which didn't help. And it didn't get off the ground either.
So dare to take more risks and dare to experiment a little bit more from the foundation side. Maria Teresa, you said that you do that at OSF, right? You do fund experiments and you do take risks. Can you say a little bit about how that works and why and how you do that?
Well, we do it because we are very privileged to sit in a place where we see what's happening in the whole world, because we fund things except the US all over the world. And so we can see where there's a space where that thing doesn't exist. So let me give you an example. A bunch of journalists, very traditional, if you could say, with a very long known experience, came together and say, we want to do a lab in Mexico. We want to do a lab that includes others, and that it's going to create a content with designers and with cartoonists and what we call in Latin America the creatives. No, with creative people, we are going to hire. We want to do something completely different that would really shake journalism in Mexico. And because of the caliber of the people who were proposing that idea, we jumped with them. I don't know if it's going to work. It's been born not long ago, but it was worth it. It was worth, because in the learning, we have learned a lot along with them, and we can share those learnings with people in other places of the world. So another thing we're doing is putting different kinds of grantees. Some of them come with a very strong engineering kind of savviness. I remember there is a project in Zimbabwe of a group that's amazing what they're doing through chat. But their journalism is not that strong. So it's really nice to put them together in this, to try and create this area where they can sit together, the ones with the great sort of ideas for distribution and engagement, and those which have really good ideas for journalism, but so that they can learn from each other and one could think about the other. So that's how we experiment a lot. And we try to believe in the people we fund. Recently, somebody asked me, ask us, but they were asking for a project in investigative journalism, and they said, well, okay, we will fund you after many back and forth. And then he said, but why you don't care to know what we are going to investigate? And we said, no, we don't want to skew your editorial agenda. We want to you are the journalist, you are the one who's interpreting the world. We don't want to tell you the real important story in your country is gender issues, because it might not be, and we can be completely wrong. So we let the journalists take the lead on that.
Thank you. Last one, and then I'll go back to the room. Ludovic, because funding experiments is kind of at the core of the D&I, right? How do you assess the results of what you fund? I know you've only been there for two years, but how do you assess?
1 year of operation,
so very short. So
yeah.
Have you thought about how to assess the results of what you fund?
Yeah,
Can you say a little bit about that?
That's a big question. Today we have funded 250 projects in 27 European countries, and only 15 to 20 are completed. So it's very hard to measure the outcome. But we're talking about the processes, and also about taking risk and not just focusing on KPIs. One of the answers is a specific track we are having called prototypes. And basically, those are cutting-edge ideas with assumptions to be tested. Those ones, for some of them, are finished. And we can start learning from them and measure the impact, at least in terms of new ways opening. So I give you one example, very, very briefly. Italian startup called Sefriel is trying to use the blockchain. You know what is the blockchain?
Yes.
So it's the backbone technology of the Bitcoin. So it's a peer-to-peer technology. They are trying to use this technology in order to certify the footage of video and to make sure you have the right, I would say, stamps, the when, the what, and the where. So these kind of things, even if it's purely a research and open source technology that can be shared, not implemented in newsroom yet, then you can see really what it can bring. And another thing is that we are following the milestones, so the progress done and how people are going through their project. And you see that innovation is something that is very alive, is changing all along the way, and we try to have those conversations and to be flexible in the way we are following the project. That is always the project of the applicant. We don't owe the IP or so on.
Thank you. Questions from the room, I think. I think there was somebody in the back who had a question before. He went away. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I took too long. All right.
Sure. I'm just curious about how much funding goes towards business innovation, and because there's no shortage of good journalists in the world, there's no shortage of content, but one of the struggles, the reason a lot of people are struggling in journalism is there isn't any money for journalism anymore. So, and I worry that just funding projects continues to paper over the fact that there isn't a systemic look at business models that are actually going to survive around the world to fund journalism on an ongoing basis.
So how much money is going to business models?
Well, yeah, or when foundations are thinking about helping journalism, are they really helping by just funding a project here or a project there, when what's actually happening is that the fundamental business model for journalism is screwed?
Who would like to take that question?
Well, I would like to say one thing about it, because you make a good point. I'm not a funder, so we sometimes receive funds, but my general rule is always that whatever it is that we're applying a grant for, we should be able to keep doing it if the fund stops. So it might help us speed up, for example, or might help us develop some preliminary things that we need in order to do something. But if we can't afford to keep doing it after the funding is over, then we shouldn't be doing it. Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I just think that there's no way, I mean, that there has to be another solution. So obviously organisations like The Guardian are looking at other issues, and one of the things they're looking at is membership. You know, they're looking, in a way you have to say, if people value this, then it needs to be paid for. And that is, at the moment, the strongest tactic that The Guardian is applying. Will it work 3 years down the line? Will 5 million people sign up to pay every week? That is our hope and that is our value. But the belief is, I personally believe that people will sign up only if there's a USP, only if the Guardian is offering something different than the traditional news agenda, which at the moment, news is there, it's available, bog standard reporting is from so many outlets. So the thing that is unique about journalism now, we have to actually be looking to do things that are different than providing information. We have to dig deeper and create stronger stories and stronger issues. And in order to do that, that's where I think the philanthropy comes in, that these stories are important and that they will be followed in the interim. But long term, unless people value it and pay for it, then it's over.
That's for me.
If you want to.
Yeah, why not? So the way for sustainability is the point to reach, of course, but we all know that today it's very complicated. I really believe in what you've said, which is the USP. Having a clear proposal, a clear readership, and I don't think there are recipes you can copy-paste anymore, but we see a lot of interesting things going on when you meet a specific audience, you have the cost that goes with that, the value proposal in terms of content offer, and then you can find people that are willing to pay. Or other models that are today interesting, that are going through diversification and so on. But of course, it's a long way, and that's why we are not just funding, but we are trying to come also with ideas, solutions through products, and that starts by conversation with publishers.
One of the things that I think we need to do much more, and today with the Google and the Facebook and all of these big platforms that are doing a lot of the advertising and capturing a lot of the money in the available in the information business, let's say, it's very important for very strategic outlets in many countries, which I can say that some are like the outlet that it's actually producing the key information, that they also have some support to really understand how to make the most of the advertising. For example, for the Google ads, there is something that they really don't know, and it's very difficult for a funder to connect those dots. And we try to do it as best as we can, but I do think that there has to be much more collaboration between funders and platforms in that sense, because we need to help those outlets. Some of them have, because of as a particular expertise of one guy, we see them doing magic, really getting quite a bit of money from, let's say, Google Ads. And yet somebody else in a different market that we see them getting a much larger audience, they make nothing because they don't know the technology, they don't know how to get into that. So that's one source of income that I think we would love to see these very strategic outlets increase. And the other, I think, is what you say, is to see the combination of fights. When you see really small outlet in Guatemala that is actually covering all its costs, you want to learn from them and say, what is it that you do? This is a tiny market. This is a young kid who's probably 28. He's set up a new business, and he's already almost very close to covering their costs because they're doing, getting members, subscribers. They do festivals. They're selling a specific kind of video advertising that's very like native advertising, but very much targeted to values, not to selling a product. So they're actually doing a very interesting original thing. So when you see this combination, you get inspired from what people... Now, there are parts in the world where it's impossible. The government forbids you to do crowdsourcing. You cannot take advertising from anybody because you're too critical of the government and nobody wants to advertise with you because you're toxic. You cannot get money from funders because that's forbidden. So those are the realities of many places.
Thank you. Any questions from the room? If there are none, could some of you maybe tell us what funders could do better? Oh, there is one. All right.
I think the magical moments at this festival happens when we talk about how journalism can innovate and go forward and experiment. So this is a question for Maggie and for Rob. Could you share a journalistic project that has been funded, that has been risky and has been bold and has been impactful? Because that's stimulating for thinking, both for journalists and for funders.
Are you a journalist yourself also?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Danish journalist.
Well, I suppose I'm biased because I'm about to leave The Guardian after 25 years to work on a project that I think has made a huge difference, and that's the project on female genital mutilation. And what happened there was we decided at The Guardian, when we were talking about the email hacking and privacy and emails, that there was a discussion one day in conference, well, hacking off the genitalia of female children 1 every 15 seconds in somewhere in this world, surely that needs to be one of the sort of top priorities of what we do. And so we ran a campaign there to get the Minister of Education to write to all schools in Britain, and that sort of took off. And then a funder, a really strange thing happened. This man turned up in our office and said, he said, I'm from Ireland and I just would like to talk to you about what you're doing. And we were so busy we didn't really have a chance to check out who he was. So he came into the office and we said, well, we're doing this and we think that we could take this to Africa, and what we need to do is we need to train journalists in boot camps with activists and teach them how to use new technology, teach them how to use WhatsApp, create communities where isolated activists and journalists can actually feel that they're part of a community. And we're going to call them campaign boot camps, journalism boot camps. And so at the end of it, he basically came up with about 3 million for 4 years to just go into Africa, get the journalists together with the activists, create the WhatsApp groups, teach them how to use smartphones, get smartphones to the journalists that needed it, and set up a whole kind of movement of grassroots journalism. And then what happened? It became a little bit uncomfortable in The Guardian because, in a sense, it became an activism journalism model. And then within The Guardian, we're saying, is this core business? Is this core journalism? And I'm thinking, what is core business? What is core journalism anymore? This could be it, because this is the kind of thing that members want. They want something different than regular reporting. So that discussion went on for some time, and now I'm leaving The Guardian to do it. So, you know, there's an example of where you can meld activism, journalism, with an inspired funder who just came to us. He just said, I see what you're doing, I'm going to support it, and took a complete punt. And he's still saying, where's the M&E? How do I know this is working? What are the metrics? And we're struggling with all that. But essentially he's doing what brave funders do, and they just sort of go with it.
Thank you. Thank you. Rob?
Oh, yeah, I was thinking of, I mean, there are many good examples, but the one that stands out for me is that we have a correspondent, Forgotten Wars, at the Correspondent. And this is a young guy, I think he's 25 or something, and he has, together with his photographer, his sole, when we first met him, he pitched his journalism as, I want to write about the people that die in vain because nobody even heard that they were in a war, and because there are a lot of wars in the news that that you see every day, like Syria, but there are many more going on. I think dozens of small or a little bit larger conflicts, civil wars between countries that you never hear about. But this is a kind of journalism that is almost unsustainable, especially for like a small startup like ours, because of the costs involved, the travels, the risks, etc. I mean, even trying to get insurance is even almost impossible. But there were funders who helped him make a few stories first, and now he was able to sell these stories to so many different outlets all over the world that it's an actual sustainable job now. And that couldn't have never have happened if some funders didn't just say, we don't know what's coming out of this. We don't even know if you're coming back. But they did it anyway, and now he has a full-time job doing it. So yeah, that would be a great example, I think.
Thank you. So Maria Teresa, I know that at Open Society Foundation, not only at your program, people think a lot about power dynamics and about agenda setting and the dangers of if you, as a funder, burst into an NGO or a news outlet, or not burst in, but if you are in contact with a newsroom or journalist and you say, I find this topic really important, and then they report on it, or if it just happens naturally because you've set out a call for applications on, for example, healthcare, and then projects start coming in, then essentially, as a foundation, you're very involved in agenda setting and therefore have quite heavily a say in what's being reported on and what's going on. So I know you think about that a lot at OSF, and I'm sure that you also think about that at your journalism program. And could you perhaps say a little bit more about how to, as a funder, but also as a grantee, navigate that road of the power dynamics between journalists on the one hand and media outlets on the one hand and funders on the other hand? Is there a limit? Is there a line? How do you navigate this?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, but I think that journalists, whatever they're doing, whatever project they're doing, they should first of all believe in themselves and not let. And even if they have trouble with the money, don't let a funder come and tell you what to do. That's my very deep belief. I do think that's easy to say and it's difficult to put in practice. When people are desperate for funds to pay the rent and to pay for their team, they end up completely off mission because the money is somewhere else. So that's like the extreme. But yeah, OSF is a very big thing. So a lot of programs in OSF fund journalism because they want to reduce crime or because they want to promote, I don't know, the safe use of how do you say that? Injections? No, to protect people, needles, yeah, for AIDS, or the protection of women, and that's that's fair if it's openly. This is what I fund. I fund issues that have to do with women, and it's broad enough. Then I think that's okay. And if you are sitting with a grantee, you have to be very careful not to be too expressive about what you like or you don't like, because immediately you leave a footprint, especially in places where this is very difficult. Now, as journalists, what we find is we don't influence in the editorial. We are, on the contrary, we do our best so that we don't even know, especially in investigative journalism, we don't want to know. We funded the ICIJ, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, for many, many years to build their platforms and all of that. And not only us, there's many other funders. And we of course, there was something cooking there and we knew, but we didn't want to know what was it. And we didn't want them to tell us, because I think it is part of their independence to really know that they can be free and that there's not going to be a backlash because, they're finding that could have this or that effect, because then you enter into politics. So I think it's a very difficult relationship. There is always a power dynamic. You cannot kid yourself and say, oh, no, there isn't. We're really good friends. We're the same. it's a very difficult thing. And it hit me because I always have my journalist hat. It's very difficult to get rid of it, and so that's difficult, yeah.
Thank you. Question in the front?
Okay, I got the microphone first, so, but I want to add a little. Can I add?
Well, you already asked one, but you can. Okay.
Because if foundations have the problem to give money to journalists and without interference, maybe we are there as Journalism Fund to be a kind of a firewall between those who give the money. That's the reason why we exist. We get money from Open Society Foundation and Attachment Foundation, so that the journalists can take the money without any string of the foundation. That's why we exist. That's the reason why we exist. So there are ways. I think there are others too, not only Journalism Fund.eu, but others who try to build that wall between the journalists and the foundations.
Thank you, Edith. I think there was a question here at the front. Rupert had a question, I know.
It's just a question for Google, actually. Because the predication that the rest of the panel has is that effectively the whole context of this is funding worthy and important journalism that furthers some kind of societal advance, that, as Nika said, it's sort of underpinning the democratic function. Google is not interested in content with this D&I fund, it's interested in news innovation. Does that mean that you're effectively blind in the applications process to innovative applications for ways of developing news that's geared towards easily monetizable, what someone called McDonald's or fast food news, and actually might not serve any great societal function at all? Or do you take steps to say, actually, we're going to fund tools that we think have that sort of democratic benefit?
Thank you.
Okay, so we are not funding content in the sense that we are not funding stories, or we are not just funding just an investigation effort or just reporting. But when you are funding a project, it doesn't mean it doesn't go with content. I give you an example. We funded Euronews for a huge VR project, which is all about having scalability and being able to put VR production into their workflow. Part of it is content production, and part of the project is journalism. But the project in itself is not just the pieces they are producing, and that's their editorial decision. We don't want to dig in that. But we want to give them the opportunity to try to write or to find new way to storytell things through VR, but the editorial decision are their decision. But some of the eligible expenses can be for journalists. So we are not funding purely content. It doesn't mean that the project doesn't have an impact on the production of quality journalism.
Thank you. Any other questions from the room?
Say it like this?
Probably, yes.
I will follow up on what Edith de Bruyne said about having an intermediary. I'm with the European Journalism Center in Maastricht. What Edith de Bruyne just said, having an intermediary between the donor and the journalist sometimes makes a lot of sense, because we can translate in both directions. And also what the law of unintended consequences is what we learned is the journalists are very much alone and singularized. I'm this little guy doing one little story in Italy with my little outlet, or a big outlet at La Stampa, but I know nobody else nowhere else. So what we saw in the journalism grants we're giving away is that people are starting to team up amongst themselves. So we bring them, all the grantees, into one room for 2 days, do a boot camp, and then they meet a German reporter who has a German outlet, and then the next round we see these two guys teaming up with a Spanish outlet. So we grow a coherence amongst the journalists, because traditionally journalists have been very much individualized, and it is a power play from the powers that be. Let them have this single little story idea and then they disappear again. And what we see as a law of unintended consequences is actually this teamwork amongst grantees that never met before, and this gives a very strong cohesion, and it also gives them hope that they're doing something that is not just particular to that one little story. Just a comment.
Thank you. Firewalls are also an option when foundations want to fund content, I think, specifically in this case. Thanks for pointing that out. Maggie, I know when we spoke before, because we're rounding up, and I'm sure everybody would love to go outside and enjoy some of that sunshine, but you had a couple of do's and don'ts. Could I nag you to sort of throw them out there just before we go?
Well, I think in a way, the most important one is the one that's been said for journalists, is that it has to be, it's too long a road and it's too painful a road unless you really care. So if you're going to go for funding and look for that, it has to be something that you're totally driven by. And very practically for the funders, in a way, I think it's coming around that the funders are looking around and saying, who are the people, finding the right people within the organizations, because I think organizations are too big. I think that media organizations are trying to find alternative ways of funding, and I think sometimes now the core content is getting bogged down in processes where people are brought in to, in a sense, monetize this relationship between the philanthropists and the journalism. So let's keep it clean, let's keep the passion there, and I think the long-term advantage of that is that in the end great journalism will triumph and people will pay for it and we'll find a sustainable model. So I would just say keep it pure, both for funders and for journalists.
Thank you. Ludovic, I know you already said that people should, read the criteria before they apply to you, because you don't just fund journalism, but is there anything else that you would like people to leave with if they're thinking about applying to the D&I?
Okay, so application window is open until April 20. So you go on the website, you look at the FAQ, we answer a lot of questions. You look at the projects we have funded, a lot of them are listed on the website. Then you try to see with which track, the prototype, the medium, and the large track fit the most with your project. You print the application form and you start working step by step through the questions. You can do that online, of course, but don't try to immediately answer all questions. Then take time to go to turn around your idea and not just to come with something, that's super idea, that's super innovative. It's not enough. And innovation, it doesn't always go with technology. So innovation can be many things. Explain why it's innovative, why does it have an impact.
Thank you. I think if journalism does die before 2030, you could try education. That was a really good set of explanations, I think. Thank you so much for that. Maria Teresa, any takeaways from you?
No, I think that I agree with what they've said. I think if you have a real passion, and as Maggie says, the people who care, I think that donors are a lot. What I've seen, maybe I'm wrong, I'm very new in this field, is that they're looking for that. They're looking for people with passion, with real passion, who really want to make a difference and to inform somebody or a group of citizens that really need that information, that they feel that's very strong. So I think it's difficult to find really good projects, and there's a lot of possibilities there.
As a funder, I second that. There's nothing that funders like to see more than people that are truly passionate about what they do. We'd rather not fund institutions and organizations. We'd rather fund people that are passionate, and especially within journalism and media. Rob, I guess...
Just one thing very quickly, because we are talking here a lot about project.
Yes.
Project is super important, but the execution is really important as well. So think about the execution too.
Thank you. Last one for you. Anything you'd like to give to the room before we all walk into the sunshine?
Well, the most important things were already said, because caring about what you do is the start. Maybe I could add that it doesn't have to threaten your independence if you work together closely with somebody who's paying for something that you want to do, if you share the things you care about. So if you share the values, you can have a very close relationship with a foundation or a funder, or the other way around with a journalist, if you're a funder, and still be independent from each other. So don't make the mistake of to mistake independence for distance, that you have to be like far from each other to be independent from each other. You can be very close to each other and still be independent.
And how should you do that? How do you stay independent?
Well, you can be close to each other because you share the same values and the same goals, and still have very clear criteria of who gets to say what is your power over the other, what are the results you're aiming for, what are the results you expect, stuff like that. So you can be very business-like in the results you expect from each other, and still be very close to each other in the values that got you in touch in the first place.
So make sure you agree on the rules of engagement, and then don't feel too worried about the rest of it.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay,
yes. Yeah.
So thank you so much for everybody for being here with us on this very late slot on a Saturday. Come find me if you have any questions.
You don't?
Well,
I have all his details.
Yeah,
a lot of them.
I already gave out all my cards.
Yeah,
I ran out of cards.
So just in case you think of something interesting, yeah.
I'll give you mine. I'm still the same number.
Can I just say thank you so much for being
Well done, you did really good.
You did really well. Yeah.
Thank you. I was tired. I noticed it.
No, you did really well.
I'll get that.
I felt tired, but I was very happy that you were here. Thank you. Hello.
There have been many misunderstandings as well. So one misunderstanding we keep getting is the views on the role of technology in journalism. So technology has always been and still is seen as a very expensive side thing for journalists. It's usually the journalism itself that is considered most important, but not the technology that is behind it. So that's always a constant struggle to try to explain why technology in a digital era is important as well and needs funding as well. But for the most part, we found that working together with foundations that support independent journalism has been very fruitful to us. The only thing, and that might be my call out to funders, and I saw 4 of them sitting right here, is that usually the logic with funders is that if something that is funded is successful and can manage on its own, then that's a reason to stop funding it, because it's independent now, it can make its own money or stuff like that, which is an understandable reasoning, but is also, it has its disadvantages, because right at the moment that something is becoming successful and can stand on its own, it might be there might be even more reasons to fund it more and accelerate growth, for example, and think more business-like about funding such projects, instead of thinking, okay, this worked, let's move on to something that needs our help next. So thinking like business-wise in granting money to, for example, startups like ours would be a smart thing, I think.
Thank you. Maria Teresa?
Okay, thank you, Ninky, for inviting me here. So what we do so this program that I direct of the Open Society Foundations is based in London, and we fund 3 basic...
My experience has been that there can also be very good relationships between foundations and journalists. We have had many of those relationships. One is sitting next to me. Others are for smaller projects that are funded by outside money. And basically we have a couple of rules in place for accepting grant money or applying for grant money. The first one is very simple. There has to be no editorial control whatsoever, or no editorial demands whatsoever. If that's not granted, then we won't accept any money at all. Second, and that's the hardest part, is there has not only to be like official independence between the grantee and the grantor, but also the appearance of independence. So we always ask ourselves the question, would we want to advertise this relationship between the foundation and us, or the other way around? Would we like them to advertise their support of us? And if the answer is no, we would not like to have that, because there would be a seemingly conflict of interest, or we would be associated with like political agendas a foundation might have. Then we would not accept such grants. That's one of the reasons probably why we usually only work with foundations that are that support journalism as such. So you have many foundations that support all kinds of political causes, whether it's renewable energy or conflicts in third world countries, and they might support media as well. We usually do not work together with those kinds of foundations. We work together most closely with foundations that support journalism in general. And it has been very fruitful.
That I was applying for grants, not as a journalist. I've noticed that there isn't a whole lot of exchange between media and philanthropy on mutual needs and expectations. How many of you are journalists in the room? Okay, good. How many of you are funders of journalism in the room? All right. All right, well, I'm happy to see some hands go up. That's good. Because it should be an exchange rather than just me talking at you or us talking at you. Nor is there really an ongoing conversation amongst funders themselves about the ins and outs and do's and don'ts of funding media. Nevertheless, this relationship is becoming increasingly relevant. The financial difficulties facing media, I don't need to elaborate on those, and it shows no signs of slowing down. So, therefore, this panel here today, I have the honor of introducing the various panelists to you. Rob Wijnberg, next to me, is the founder and editor-in-chief of The Correspondent, and more recently, The Correspondent. I hope you've all heard that they're expanding to the United States together with Jay Rosen. It's a relatively young online journalism platform, media platform, well known for having crowdfunded its origins and being one of relatively few startups running on a successful business model based on subscriptions and no advertising. However, it also started off, aside from that very successful beginning, there was also a grant from us, so I'll be transparent about that, which in part also allowed it to develop. So, and you also do sometimes apply for funds to do extra projects. Next to Rob is Maria Teresa Ronderos, the director of the OSF program on independent journalism, and one of two people from Latin America at this festival this week. Formerly an award-winning journalist in Colombia, Maria Teresa now invests in journalism as well as in the protection of the safety of journalists, supports initiatives led by individuals or collectives that strive to improve their journalism under difficult circumstances, and prioritizes initiatives, and not just that, also seek to further engage their audiences, experiment with storytelling, and develop new sources of revenue, a media funding program. OSF is well known for many other things, but this is also a large part of their mission statement. Next to Maria Teresa, Maggie O'Kane. Maggie O'Kane, currently multimedia editor investigations at The Guardian, but will leave The Guardian after 25 years next week to be full-time on the global media campaign to end female genital mutilation. She's a former foreign correspondent, the founder of The Guardian Films, and also the future chair of the European Press Prize. The Guardian, of course, we all know how they work, but they also do sometimes take grants from various foundations. And then the last person on this panel is not in philanthropy, and he will tell you that. I think, perhaps, at least that's what he told me. But he is the director of the digital news initiative that was started by Google and a couple of other partners. He funds projects. He's a former editor-in-chief of Liberation.France and also a Nieman Fellow, and also many other things. And I know I'm talking too long. But the DNI is a partnership between Google and news publisher in Europe to support high-quality journalism through technology and innovation, gives out grants, but also invests in training and research, amongst other things. Since it was founded in 2015, it has awarded more than 50 million euros to more than 250 projects. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that's been going for you. But first of all, if you could all perhaps just very briefly elaborate on what your relationship is to this subject and what the first thing is that comes to mind when you talk about media and philanthropy. Rob, will you start?
Oh, do I have to start? Okay.
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm first in line. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Nieke. What comes to mind in this subject? Well, first of all, what comes to mind is this stressed relationship between foundations and journalists in general. There's, I experience a lot of distrust over and between those parties, especially amongst journalists, of course, because journalists feel any kind of funding coming from foundations or other parties, maybe like Google, could hurt their independence. And there are many reasons to think so.
Yeah, so do the briefing, yeah.
You are going to talk, of course.
Ik heb het gelezen.
Ik ga dingen voorlezen, dat is heel slecht. Maar ik schrijf altijd wat ik wil zeggen.
Echt?
Ja, ik weet dat het heel slecht is, maar ik voel me gewoon echt lekkerder als ik het gewoon voorlees.
Ja?
Ja.
Maar dat ligt. Ja, dan moet je gewoon een paar keer niet doen en dan ben je er vanaf. Het is een beetje zoals roken.
Zal ik het dan nu proberen? Dan heel hard op mijn bek gaan?
Ja.
Ja.
Ja. Daar ben ik graag bij.
It's 2 minutes, I think. Yeah.
All right. Is speaking in the microphone because we are recording everything, so you can also
Ga ik toch maar wel voorlezen.
Okay.
Ja. Okay.
This is our chair.
I'm
our chair.
I'll end on time.
Hello. Hi, Rob.
Weinberg.
Hello.
Maggie.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Hello.
Perfect. Okay, yeah, that's good.
Oh.
Is it time to start?
Good thing.
All right, thank you everybody so much for being here. I know that there were a couple of competitors, the CEO of the New York Times, The Sun, so, you know, the bar. Assisi is close as well. So thank you so much for being here with us at 6 on Saturday of a very intense and full festival. I am Nienke Venema. I am the director of the Democracy and Media Foundation, Stichting Democratie en Media. This is a Dutch foundation based in Amsterdam. And a little bit about us, we were founded during the Second World War to be the sole owner of one of the resistance newspapers after the war would end, because the people that founded this newspaper didn't believe in commercial ownership of media, so they wanted it to be owned by a foundation instead. Now, 70 years later, a lot has happened, but we're still a shareholder of a couple of dailies in the Netherlands, and we also fund journalism and we fund media organizations. I wrote to the Journalism Festival about the possibility of hosting this panel because since I have been working at the Democracy and Media Foundation before